As you settle into this quiet space, letting your body sink into the surface beneath you, feeling the gentle weight of your limbs, the soft rhythm of your breathing, we are going to take a journey together through the thoughts of one of history's most influential philosophers. His name was René Descartes, and he lived in France during the 17th century, a time when the world was changing in profound ways, when old certainties were being questioned and new ways of thinking were beginning to emerge. But this journey will not be hurried or demanding. It will unfold slowly and gently, like a stream flowing through a peaceful landscape, and you need only let yourself drift along with it, letting the ideas wash over you without strain or effort. Descartes was born in 1596 in a small town in central France, into a world very different from our own. He grew up during a time when the authority of ancient philosophers like Aristotle was still powerful, when the church held enormous influence over what people could think and say, when the scientific revolution was just beginning to gather momentum. As a young man, Descartes received an excellent education at a Jesuit college, where he studied mathematics, philosophy, and the classical texts that formed the foundation of European learning. But even as a student, he found himself dissatisfied with much of what he was taught. The philosophy he studied seemed to him to be filled with disputes and uncertainties, with different schools of thought contradicting one another, with questions that seemed to have no definitive answers. Let your breathing deepen. Now, let your shoulders relax. Let any tension in your body begin to release. There is no hurry in this story, no urgency to grasp every detail. The thoughts will continue to unfold at their own gentle pace, and you can simply allow yourself to rest while they do. After completing his formal education, Descartes spent several years traveling through Europe, serving briefly in military campaigns, meeting scholars and thinkers, observing the diversity of customs and beliefs in different places. These travels reinforced his sense that the learning he had acquired in school was inadequate, that what people believed often depended more on accident and custom than on reason or evidence. He saw that what was considered obviously true in one place might be rejected as false in another, that moral rules varied from culture to culture, that even basic beliefs about the nature of reality were subject to disagreement. This experience of diversity and disagreement led him to a profound question, a question that would shape the rest of his philosophical work. Is there anything, he wondered, that we can know with absolute certainty? Is there any foundation of knowledge that is so secure, so indubitable, that it can serve as a starting point for rebuilding all of human understanding on more solid ground? These questions occupied Descartes for many years. He withdrew from public life for long periods, seeking solitude and quiet where he could think deeply without distraction. And in 1628, he settled in the Netherlands, where he would remain for most of the rest of his life, living in various cities and towns, always seeking places where he could work undisturbed. It was during these years in the Netherlands that Descartes developed his philosophical method and wrote the works that would make him famous, works that would influence the course of Western philosophy for centuries to come. The central project of Descartes' philosophy was to establish a secure foundation for knowledge, to find something that could not possibly be doubted, and then to build up from that foundation a complete understanding of reality. He called this method the method of doubt, and it involved systematically questioning everything he had ever believed, stripping away all assumptions and opinions, until he found something that was absolutely certain, something that could not be doubted, no matter how hard he tried. This was not a modest goal. Descartes wanted nothing less than to reconstruct human knowledge from the ground up, to create a new philosophy that would be as certain and reliable as mathematics, that would replace the confused and contradictory teachings of the past with clear and distinct truths that no reasonable person could deny. He began this process by asking what he could doubt, and he found, to his initial dismay, that he could doubt almost everything. He could doubt the testimony of his senses, because the senses sometimes deceive us. We see things in the distance that turn out to be different when we get closer. We feel pain in limbs that have been amputated. We experience vivid dreams that seem completely real while we are dreaming, only to realize upon waking that they were illusions. If our senses can deceive us sometimes, Descartes reasoned, then how can we be certain they are not deceiving us all the time? How can we be sure that what we think we see and hear and touch is really there, rather than being some kind of elaborate illusion or dream? This was a troubling thought, but Descartes pressed on. He found that he could even doubt mathematical truths, at least in principle. Perhaps, he imagined, there is some powerful deceiving demon, some malicious being who is determined to fool him, who has the power to make him believe that 2 plus 2 equals 4, even when it does not, who can manipulate his thoughts so that even the most obvious truths seem true when they are actually false. This was an extreme hypothesis, a kind of thought experiment designed to test the limits of doubt. Descartes did not actually believe in such a demon, but he used this idea as a tool, a way of asking whether there is anything so certain that even the most extreme skeptical doubt cannot touch it. In the midst of this radical doubt, this systematic questioning of everything he had ever believed, Descartes found something that he could not doubt. He could doubt the existence of the external world. He could doubt his own body. He could doubt mathematics and logic and everything he had ever learned. But there was one thing he could not doubt. He could not doubt that he was doubting. And if he was doubting, then he was thinking. And if he was thinking, then he must exist. For how could there be thinking without a thinker? How could there be doubt without someone who doubts? This led Descartes to his most famous conclusion, the statement that would become perhaps the most well-known philosophical claim in history. I think, therefore I am. In Latin, cogito ergo sum. This simple statement, I think therefore I am, was for Descartes the absolutely certain foundation he had been seeking. It was immune to even the most extreme doubt. The very act of doubting proved that he existed, because doubt is a form of thinking, and thinking requires a thinker. Even if everything else were an illusion, even if an evil demon were deceiving him about everything, the fact that he was being deceived would prove that he existed. For there must be an I, a self, a thinking thing, in order for deception or thought or doubt to occur. This realization gave Descartes his secure starting point, the rock upon which he could build his philosophical system. But what exactly was this I that Descartes had discovered? What kind of thing is it that thinks and therefore exists? Descartes reflected carefully on this question. He noticed that he could doubt the existence of his body. After all, bodies are perceived through the senses, and the senses might be deceiving him. He might be dreaming, or hallucinating, or being fooled by that imaginary demon. So he could doubt that he had a body, but he could not doubt that he was thinking. Therefore, he concluded, his essence, What he most fundamentally was could not be his body. It must be something else. It must be a thinking thing, a mind, a consciousness. He was, essentially, a thing that thinks, a res cogitans, as he put it in Latin. This conclusion had profound implications. Descartes had established not only that he existed, but what kind of thing he was. He was fundamentally a mind, a thinking substance, something whose entire nature consists in consciousness and thought. His body, if it existed at all, was something separate from his essential self. This led to what philosophers would later call Cartesian dualism, the view that reality consists of two fundamentally different kinds of substance. There is mental substance, which thinks but does not occupy space, which is conscious and aware but has no physical properties. And there is physical substance, matter, which occupies space and has extension and shape and motion, but which is not conscious, which does not think or feel or experience anything. This division between mind and matter, between the thinking self and the physical world, would become one of the most influential and controversial aspects of Descartes' philosophy. It raised difficult questions that philosophers are still grappling with today. If mind and matter are completely different kinds of substance, with nothing in common, then how do they interact? How does your immaterial mind cause your material body to move when you decide to raise your arm? How do physical events in your body, like stubbing your toe, cause mental events, like feeling pain? Descartes himself struggled with these questions, and his answers were not entirely satisfactory, as he himself seemed to recognize. Having established that he existed as a thinking thing, Descartes needed to rebuild the rest of his knowledge. He had found his first certainty, his secure foundation, but he was still trapped, in a sense, in his own mind. He knew he existed and that he was thinking, but he did not yet know whether anything else existed. Was there really an external world of physical objects? Did other people exist? Did his own body exist? Or was he just a disembodied mind, perhaps being deceived by that imaginary demon, experiencing thoughts and sensations that corresponded to nothing real outside his own consciousness? To escape from this solitary prison of his own mind, Descartes needed to prove that God exists. This might seem like a strange move in a philosophical argument, but Descartes believed it was essential. If he could prove that God exists, and that God is perfectly good and not a deceiver, then he would have reason to trust at least some of his clear and distinct perceptions. A perfect God would not systematically deceive him about the existence of the external world, about the basic truths of mathematics and logic, about the reliability of his rational faculties. So Descartes set out to prove God's existence, using several different arguments. One of these arguments began with the observation that Descartes had an idea of God in his mind, an idea of a perfect being, infinite in power and goodness and knowledge. Where did this idea come from? Descartes reasoned that an effect must have a cause that is at least as real and perfect as the effect itself. The idea of an infinite and perfect being was an effect in his mind that needed a cause. But Descartes himself was finite and imperfect, as were all the other possible sources of this idea in the created world. Therefore, the idea of God must have been caused by God himself. God must exist and must have implanted this idea of himself in Descartes' mind. Only an actually infinite and perfect being could be the adequate cause of the idea of such a being. Descartes offered other arguments for God's existence as well, including a version of what is called the ontological argument, This argument claims that the very idea of God, when properly understood, necessarily implies God's existence. A perfect being must exist, because existence is a perfection, and a being that lacked existence would not be perfect. This argument has been debated by philosophers for centuries, with some finding it convincing and others finding it deeply flawed. But for Descartes, it provided additional support for his belief that God exists. Having established to his own satisfaction that God exists and is perfect, Descartes could then move forward to re-establish his knowledge of the external world. If God is perfect, he reasoned, then God would not deceive him about the basic reliability of his faculties. God would not give him a strong, natural inclination to believe that physical objects exist and then make that belief systematically false. Therefore, when Descartes had clear and distinct perceptions, when something appeared to his mind with absolute clarity and distinctness, he could trust that perception. This was the criterion of truth that Descartes would use to rebuild his knowledge. Clear and distinct perception guaranteed by a non-deceiving God. This allowed Descartes to restore his confidence in mathematics and logic, which had been threatened by his method of doubt. Mathematical truths, when clearly and distinctly perceived, could be trusted, and it also allowed him to believe in the existence of the physical world, though with some important qualifications. The physical world exists, and it has certain properties that we can know with certainty. But the world, as it really is, might be quite different from the world as it appears to our senses. Descartes believed that the essence of physical reality is extension, the property of taking up space, of having length and width and height. Matter is, fundamentally, just three-dimensional space divided up into different regions with different shapes and motions. All the properties of physical things that we can understand clearly and distinctly, all the properties that belong to the science of physics, can be reduced to geometry and motion. Size, shape, position, velocity, these are the real properties of matter, the properties that matter actually has independent of our perception of it. But what about the other properties that we seem to perceive in physical objects? What about colors and sounds and smells and tastes and tactile qualities like warmth and texture? Descartes argued that these sensory qualities are not really in the objects themselves. They are, rather, in our minds, in our consciousness. Physical objects have the power to cause certain sensations in us when they interact with our sense organs. But the sensations themselves, the experienced redness of red or the heard loudness of a sound, these exist only in the mind. The external world is, in itself, colorless and silent and without smell or taste. It is just matter in motion, particles with various sizes and shapes and velocities, interacting according to mathematical laws. This view, that the world as it appears to our senses is quite different from the world as it really is, would become extremely influential in the development of modern science. It suggested that to understand nature, we need to look past the appearances, past the sensory qualities, to the underlying mathematical structure. We need to measure and quantify, to discover the laws that govern matter in motion, to replace the rich qualitative experience of everyday perception with the spare quantitative descriptions of mathematical physics. This approach has been enormously successful in advancing human knowledge and technological capability, but it has also created philosophical puzzles that remain unresolved. If the world, as described by physics, is so different from the world we experience, what is the relationship between these two descriptions. Where does conscious experience, with all its color and sound and feeling, fit into a universe of matter in motion? The relationship between mind and body remained problematic in Descartes' philosophy. He was committed to the view that they are distinct substances, that the mind is non-physical and the body is non-mental. But he also had to account for the obvious fact that mind and body interact. When you decide to move your hand moves. When your body is injured, you feel pain. These interactions seem to require causal connections between the mental and the physical, between two substances that Descartes had defined as having nothing in common. Descartes proposed that the point of interaction between mind and body is a small gland in the brain called the pineal gland. He thought this was where the immaterial soul directly influenced the material body, where mental decisions were translated into physical movements, where physical stimuli were converted into conscious experiences. But this answer raised more questions than it resolved. How exactly does an immaterial substance interact with a material gland? What is the mechanism of this interaction? If mind and matter are fundamentally different kinds of substance, with completely different properties, how can they causally affect each other at all? These difficulties led later philosophers to modify or reject Descartes' dualism. Some argued that there is only one substance, either mental or physical, and that what appears to be the other kind is really just a different aspect or property of that single substance. Others proposed that mind and body do not actually interact, but only appear to do so because God has coordinated them, making mental events and physical events occur in parallel without causally influencing each other. Still others developed more subtle accounts of the relationship between consciousness and the physical world. But Descartes himself, despite recognizing the difficulty, maintained his commitment to the fundamental distinction between mind and matter, between the thinking self and the extended world. Your breathing has become very slow now, very gentle, like the breathing of sleep. Your body is heavy and still. Your thoughts are sparse and drifting. Let the philosophical puzzles dissolve. Let the questions fade into the background. The essence of Descartes' vision can be felt without being fully grasped, can be appreciated without being completely understood. What is perhaps most remarkable about Descartes' philosophical project is its ambition and its method. He was not content to accept inherited wisdom or to build on the work of previous philosophers. He wanted to start from the beginning, to tear down the structure of belief and rebuild it from the foundation up, using only reason and clear thinking as his tools. This impulse to question everything, to accept nothing without rigorous proof, to demand absolute certainty as the standard for knowledge, this has become a defining feature of modern Western philosophy. Whether we agree with Descartes' specific conclusions or not, we have inherited his spirit of critical inquiry, his refusal to accept things simply because they are traditional or widely believed, his insistence on thinking for ourselves and following arguments wherever they lead. Descartes believed that reason was universal, that all human beings share the same basic rational capacities, and that if we use reason correctly, we will all arrive at the same truths. This was a democratic and optimistic vision in some ways, suggesting that truth is accessible to anyone who thinks clearly and carefully, regardless of their education or social position. But it also led Descartes to underestimate the role of culture, history, emotion, and embodiment in human thinking. He imagined the mind as a pure rational faculty, operating according to timeless logical principles, largely independent of the body and the social world. Later thinkers would challenge this view, arguing that reason is always situated, always influenced by context and perspective, that there is no view from nowhere, no purely objective standpoint from which to survey reality. But even as we recognize the limitations of Descartes' approach, we can appreciate what he achieved. He asked fundamental questions about the nature of knowledge, reality, and the self. He developed a systematic method for pursuing these questions. He offered clear arguments and defended his positions with rigor and care. He changed the way philosophers think about consciousness, about the relationship between mind and world, about the foundations of knowledge. His influence extends not only through philosophy, but also through mathematics, where he invented analytic geometry, and through the sciences, where his mechanistic view of nature helped to clear the ground for modern physics. As you rest here on the threshold of sleep, as consciousness dims and the waking world recedes, you can appreciate how Descartes' questions remain relevant even now, centuries after he first asked them. What can we know with certainty? What is the relationship between consciousness and the physical brain? How does the mind interact with the body? What is the nature of the self? These are not just historical questions or abstract puzzles. They touch on the deepest aspects of our existence, on what it means to be a conscious being in a physical universe, on how we can trust our thoughts and perceptions, on what we most fundamentally are. Let the questions dissolve now into the peaceful darkness. Let Descartes' voice fade into silence. Let the 17th century, with all its controversies and discoveries, become distant and dreamlike. You have travelled with him on his philosophical journey, from radical doubt through the discovery of the thinking self, through arguments about God and the external world, through reflections on mind and matter and the nature of reality. And now you can let all of that go, can allow it to settle into the background of your mind, can simply rest in the quiet, knowing that these questions were asked, these thoughts were thought, this vision was articulated, and that it remains part of the great conversation of human inquiry. Descartes himself, after years of intensive philosophical work, died in 1650 in Stockholm, Sweden, where he had travelled at the invitation of Queen Christina to be her personal tutor in philosophy. The harsh Swedish winter and the Queen's habit of scheduling lessons at 5 in the morning proved too much for his constitution, and he fell ill and died at the age of 53. But his ideas lived on, continuing to influence thinkers long after his death, continuing to shape how we think about ourselves and the world, continuing to provoke debate and reflection and new philosophical investigations. The image that sometimes arose in Descartes' philosophy was of the isolated self, the mind locked in its own inner world, trying to figure out whether anything exists beyond its own thoughts. This image has been criticized as creating too much separation between self and world, too much emphasis on individual reason at the expense of community and tradition, too much confidence in the power of abstract thought to arrive at truth. And yet there is something profound in this image as well, something that resonates with the actual experience of being a conscious subject. We do seem to be, in some sense, locked in our own perspective, experiencing the world from within, unable to step outside our own consciousness to verify that our perceptions match reality. Each of us is, in a way, in the position that Descartes described in his meditations, starting from our own inner experience, trying to understand what lies beyond it, using reason and reflection to construct a picture of reality that goes beyond immediate sensation. And like Descartes, we find that certainty is elusive, that doubts can be raised about almost anything, that the foundations of knowledge are more uncertain than we might wish. But also, like Descartes, we find that some things resist doubt, that the fact of our own existence as thinking beings seems undeniable, that from this starting point we can build at least a provisional understanding of ourselves and our world. The certainty that Descartes sought, the absolute foundation for knowledge. Perhaps it was there all along, not in the cogito, but in the simple fact of existence itself, in being here, in breathing, in the quiet presence that underlies all thought and all doubt. I am yes, but more fundamental than the I and more fundamental than the thinking is simply the being, the existing, the presence that does not need to prove itself or justify itself or explain itself. It just is, prior to all questions, deeper than all answers, holding everything in its silent embrace. Descartes would have understood, perhaps. For all his emphasis on reason and doubt and clear thinking, he also knew the value of rest, of allowing the mind to lie fallow, of letting go of problems and trusting that solutions would come in time. He knew that not all knowing is explicit or verbal, that sometimes we understand things in ways that cannot be fully articulated, that the deepest truths are often the simplest and the most immediate. As you continue to sink deeper into this peaceful state, we can linger a while longer with Descartes' vision of reality, letting the ideas wash over you like gentle waves, not demanding your attention, but simply present, like soft music in the background of consciousness. Descartes lived in a time of great change and uncertainty, a time when the old medieval worldview was crumbling and a new scientific understanding was being born. The earth was no longer the center of the universe. The heavens were no longer perfect and unchanging. The authority of ancient texts was being challenged by observation and experiment. In this atmosphere of intellectual upheaval, Descartes sought certainty, sought a foundation that could not be shaken by the winds of change. His method of doubt was not meant to promote skepticism for its own sake. Descartes was not trying to prove that we cannot know anything. Rather, he was trying to clear away all uncertain beliefs, all opinions and assumptions that might turn out to be false, in order to discover what remains when all doubtful things have been set aside. It was like clearing a forest to build a house, removing the dead wood and the unstable trees to find solid ground. The doubt was a tool, a method, not a conclusion. And the goal was always certainty, always secure knowledge, always a clear understanding of reality that could withstand any challenge. When Descartes discovered his foundational certainty in the cogito, in the I think, therefore I am, he had found his starting point. But this was only the beginning of his philosophical journey. From this single point of certainty, he needed to rebuild an entire world. He needed to prove that his reasoning faculty could be trusted, that mathematics and logic were reliable, that the physical world existed outside his mind, that other minds existed, that he was not alone in a universe of his own thoughts. Each step required careful argument, careful reasoning, building up from what was already known to what was still uncertain. The role of God in Descartes' philosophy might seem strange to modern readers. Why should a philosophical system depend on proving God's existence? But for Descartes, God was essential precisely because God was the guarantor of truth, the foundation that made knowledge possible. If God exists and is perfect, then God would not give us faculties of reason and perception that systematically deceive us. God would not create us with a strong inclination to believe that the external world exists if that belief were entirely false. God would not make mathematical truths appear self-evident if they were actually false. So the existence of a perfect, non-deceiving God became the bridge that allowed Descartes to move from his own inner certainty to knowledge of the world beyond his mind. This reliance on God has been criticized by later philosophers. It seems to make the entire system depend on proving something that many find unprovable, and even if God's existence could be proved, the assumption that God would not allow us to be deceived might not be warranted. After all, we are deceived sometimes. Our senses do mislead us. Our reasoning does make mistakes. So even if God exists, God apparently allows some degree of error and illusion in human cognition. But Descartes would respond that God allows small errors, local mistakes, not systematic and complete deception. God has given us the tools to correct our errors, to recognize when we are being misled by our senses, to distinguish clear and distinct perceptions from confused and obscure ones. As you rest here in the darkness, feeling sleep approaching gradually and naturally, you might notice how the questions Descartes asked touch on your own experience. How do you know that you are not dreaming right now? How do you know that the world you perceive actually exists? How do you know that your memories are reliable? These are not just abstract philosophical puzzles. They arise naturally when we reflect on the nature of our experience, when we notice the gap between how things appear to us and how they might actually be. And while we may not follow Descartes in all his answers, his questions remain relevant, remain worth contemplating, remain part of the human search for understanding. Descartes' account of the physical world was deeply influenced by his commitment to mathematical clarity. He believed that the essence of matter was extension, the geometrical property of taking up space. This meant that the physical world could be understood through geometry and mathematics. The shapes and sizes and motions of material objects, the ways they interact and combine and change, all of this could be described mathematically, could be reduced to clear and quantifiable relationships. This was a radical simplification of the physical world, stripping away all the qualitative richness that we perceive through our senses and leaving only the bare mathematical structure underneath. But this simplification was also liberating. It meant that nature could be studied scientifically, that laws could be discovered, that predictions could be made and tested. The mathematical description of nature became the foundation for modern physics, for the scientific revolution that would transform human understanding and human capability. Descartes himself made important contributions to this scientific worldview, developing theories about light and matter and motion, conducting experiments, corresponding with other scientists and mathematicians of his time. His philosophy and his science were deeply intertwined, each supporting and informing the other. The question of sensory qualities, of colours and sounds and tastes and smells, presented a challenge for Descartes' mathematical physics. These qualities do not seem to be purely geometrical. The redness of red is not a shape or a size or a motion. The sweetness of sugar is not a mathematical property. So where do these qualities come from? Descartes' answer was that they are in the mind, not in the objects. Physical objects have only mathematical properties, extension and motion, but when these objects interact with our sense organs, they cause certain sensations in our minds. The redness is our mental response to certain wavelengths of light. The sweetness is our mental response to certain molecular structures. The qualities we perceive are real, but they are real features of our consciousness, not real features of the external world. This view has profound implications. It suggests that the world as we experience it, rich with color and sound and flavor and texture, is in some sense our own creation, or at least our own contribution. The world itself, independent of our perception, is colorless and silent and tasteless. It is just particles in motion, following mathematical laws. Everything we think of as the beauty and richness of nature, all the sensory qualities that make the world vivid and alive, these exist only in consciousness, only in the subjective experience of beings like us who have minds and senses. Some philosophers have found this view troubling. It seems to impoverish the world, to drain it of its intrinsic value and beauty, to suggest that all the qualities we care about most are merely subjective, merely in our minds. Others have embraced it as the price of scientific understanding, the necessary sacrifice that allows us to grasp the underlying mathematical order of nature. And still others have sought middle paths, trying to preserve some objectivity for sensory qualities while still acknowledging the insights of mathematical physics. Descartes' dualism of mind and matter created what philosophers call the mind-body problem, which remains one of the central puzzles in philosophy of mind today. If mental substance and material substance are fundamentally different, if they share no properties in common, then how can they interact? How can your decision to raise your arm, which is a mental event, cause your arm to move, which is a physical event? And how can damage to your brain, which is a physical change, affect your thoughts and personality and consciousness, which are mental? The interaction seems to require some common ground, some point of contact, but Descartes' strict dualism makes such common ground impossible. Later philosophers proposed various solutions. Some, like Spinoza, argued that mind and matter are not two different substances, but two attributes of a single substance, two ways of conceiving the same reality. Others, like Leibniz, suggested that mind and matter never actually interact, but only appear to do so because God has pre-established a harmony between them, making mental events and physical events run in parallel like two synchronized clocks. Still others, like the materialists, argued that only matter exists, and that mind is really just a special configuration or function of matter, that consciousness arises from physical processes in the brain. In our own time, the mind-body problem remains unresolved. We have learned an enormous amount about the brain and its relationship to consciousness. We can trace neural correlates of mental states, can observe which brain regions are active during different kinds of thinking and perceiving and feeling. We can alter consciousness by altering brain chemistry, through drugs or by stimulating or damaging specific brain areas. All of this suggests an intimate connection between mind and brain, but it does not fully explain how subjective experience arises from objective physical processes. How does the firing of neurons become the felt quality of seeing red or feeling pain? This is what philosopher David Chalmers calls the hard problem of consciousness, and it echoes Descartes' old puzzle in a new form. Descartes wrote his major philosophical works in Latin, the scholarly language of his time, but he also wrote some works in French, making them accessible to a broader audience, including educated people who had not studied Latin. His most famous philosophical work, the Meditations on First Philosophy, takes the form of a 6-day journey, with each day's meditation building on the previous ones, moving from radical doubt through the discovery of the thinking self, through proofs of God's existence, through arguments about the external world and the nature of matter, finally arriving at a complete metaphysical system. The work is structured as a personal intellectual journey, inviting the reader to follow along, to doubt and discover and reason along with the author. This personal meditative style was part of what made Descartes' philosophy so influential. He was not just presenting abstract arguments, he was inviting readers to undergo the same intellectual experience he had undergone, to travel the same path from doubt to certainty, to discover for themselves the foundations of knowledge. This made philosophy feel less like a body of doctrines to be learned and more like a practice to be undertaken, an activity of the mind that each person must engage in for themselves. As you lie here in the peaceful quiet, you are in a sense doing what Descartes invited his readers to do. You are turning inward, attending to your own consciousness, noticing the quality of your own experience. You are not taking anything on authority. You are simply observing what is there, what is undeniable, what presents itself directly to awareness. And what you find is not a philosophical system or a set of arguments, but something simpler and more immediate. The fact of being aware, the feeling of existing, the gentle flow of consciousness as it moves toward sleep. Descartes lived simply in the Netherlands, avoiding the controversies and intrigues of court life, dedicating himself to study and writing. He maintained correspondence with scholars throughout Europe, engaging in philosophical debates, sharing ideas, learning from others, and teaching others in turn. He was part of what historians call the Republic of Letters, an international community of scholars who communicated through letters, sharing their work and their thoughts across national and linguistic boundaries. This intellectual community was crucial to the development of modern science and philosophy, creating a space where ideas could be freely exchanged and debated without the constraints of local authorities. But Descartes also had to be careful. His ideas were controversial, particularly his mechanistic account of nature, which seemed to some to threaten religious doctrine. He had seen what happened to Galileo, who was forced by the Inquisition to recant his support for the heliocentric theory. So Descartes was cautious about publishing, sometimes withholding works or modifying them to avoid offending religious authorities. He wanted to pursue truth through reason, but he also wanted to stay out of trouble, to avoid persecution, to be able to continue his work in peace. The influence of Descartes' philosophy extended far beyond his own lifetime. His emphasis on mathematical reasoning shaped the development of modern science. His method of systematic doubt became a model for critical thinking. His arguments about the nature of the self influenced psychology and theories of consciousness. His mind-body dualism set the terms for centuries of debate about the relationship between mental and physical. Even philosophers who disagreed with him were shaped by their engagement with his ideas, defining their own positions in relation to his, accepting some of his insights while rejecting others. The image of the thinking subject, the Cartesian ego, the I that thinks and therefore exists, this became central to modern Western philosophy and culture. It reinforced the idea of the individual as the fundamental unit of society, as the source of knowledge and moral judgment, as the foundation of political rights and freedoms. For better or worse, we are all, in some sense, children of Descartes, inheritors of his vision of the self as a thinking thing, as a rational subject standing apart from the world, seeking to understand it through reason and observation. But this Cartesian legacy has also been questioned and criticized. Some argue that it creates too much separation between self and world, too much emphasis on abstract reason at the expense of embodied experience, too much confidence in the isolated individual and not enough recognition of our dependence on community and tradition. Feminist philosophers have criticized the Cartesian self as implicitly masculine, privileging traditionally male-associated traits like detachment and rationality over traditionally female-associated traits like connection and emotion. Phenomenologists have argued that Descartes' starting point in the thinking subject misses the more fundamental fact of being in the world, of existing, always already embedded in contexts and relationships. These criticisms and revisions are themselves part of Descartes' legacy. He asked fundamental questions and offered clear answers, and this very clarity made it possible for others to engage with his ideas, to test them, to develop alternatives. Philosophy advances not just through agreement, but through productive disagreement, through the critical examination of influential ideas. And Descartes' ideas have been among the most influential in the Western philosophical tradition, providing a touchstone and a target for centuries of subsequent thought. Perhaps this nightly dissolution has something to teach us about the limits of Descartes' philosophy. Perhaps the waking world of clear distinctions and rational thought is not the only reality, or even the most fundamental reality. Perhaps there are modes of being and knowing that transcend the categories of mind and matter, subject and object, self and world. Perhaps consciousness in its depths is not primarily a thinking thing, but something more mysterious, more fluid, more interconnected with the rest of reality. And as you rest in this deepening peace, we can reflect for a few more moments on what Descartes' philosophical journey reveals about the human search for understanding. His method was rigorous and systematic, but it was also driven by something deeply personal, a need to find solid ground in a world of uncertainty, to discover something that could not be shaken by doubt or time or change. This search for certainty is something that resonates across centuries, across cultures. We all want to know that something is real, that something can be trusted, that we stand on solid ground rather than shifting sand. Descartes found his certainty in the act of thinking itself. The very process of questioning, of doubting, of wondering whether anything is real, this proved beyond doubt that he existed. Because there must be a someone doing the questioning, a mind engaged in the doubting, a self that thinks and therefore is. This was his breakthrough, his moment of clarity in the midst of radical uncertainty. And from this single point of light, this one certainty, he attempted to illuminate everything else, to rebuild the entire edifice of human knowledge on this foundation of self-evident truth. The question of whether Descartes succeeded in his grand project remains debated by philosophers. Some argue that his proofs for God's existence are flawed, that his criterion of clear and distinct perception is circular, that his dualism creates more problems than it solves. Others defend his insights while modifying his conclusions, accepting the importance of the cogito while rejecting the substance dualism, embracing his emphasis on reason while questioning his confidence in absolute certainty. Still others reject his entire approach, arguing that the search for absolute foundations is misguided, that knowledge must always be provisional and contextual, that certainty is an impossible ideal. But regardless of these philosophical debates, Descartes' meditation on the nature of the self and reality changed something fundamental in Western thought. He turned philosophy inward, made the thinking subject the starting point, made consciousness and self-awareness central to any account of knowledge and reality. Before Descartes, philosophy often began with the external world, with nature, with being itself. After Descartes, philosophy increasingly began with the subject, with experience, with the arm that knows and perceives and thinks. This shift, sometimes called the epistemological turn, shaped everything that came after, from empiricism to idealism to phenomenology to contemporary philosophy of mind. The question of personal identity that emerges from Descartes' philosophy is particularly intriguing. If I am essentially a thinking thing, if my true nature is mental rather than physical, then what makes me the same person over time? My body changes constantly, every cell eventually replaced. My thoughts and beliefs evolve, my memories fade and transform. What remains constant? Descartes would say that it is the thinking substance itself, the res cogitans, that persists through all these changes. But this raises puzzles. What individuates one thinking substance from another? What makes this thinking thing me, rather than you? Is there some quality or property that makes each mind unique? Or is personal identity more about continuity of consciousness, about the unbroken stream of experience that connects my present self to all my past selves? As you continue to drift here in the gentle darkness, as consciousness becomes more diffuse and less defined, you might notice how the sense of personal identity becomes looser, less insistent. In the transition towards sleep, the boundaries of the self soften. You are still here, still aware in some sense, but the sharp definition of I begins to blur. Perhaps this nightly dissolution of the rigid self reveals something about the nature of identity. Perhaps the Cartesian ego, the clearly defined thinking subject, is something that exists fully only in waking consciousness, something that forms and dissolves according to the state of awareness, something more fluid and less substantial than Descartes imagined. The distinction Descartes drew between primary and secondary qualities, between the mathematical properties that really exist in objects and the sensory qualities that exist only in the mind, had enormous influence on the development of science. It suggested that to truly understand nature, we must look past the surface appearances, past what our senses tell us, to the underlying mathematical structure. This approach proved extraordinarily fruitful. By treating the physical world as essentially mathematical, as describable through equations and quantifiable relationships, science has achieved remarkable success in predicting and controlling natural phenomena. But this success has also created a puzzle that remains unresolved. If the mathematical description of nature is complete, if everything in the physical world can in principle be explained through equations describing matter in motion, then where does consciousness fit in? Where do the vivid colors and sounds and feelings of conscious experience belong in this mathematical universe? Descartes' dualism provided an answer by placing consciousness in a separate realm of mental substance. But if we reject dualism, if we believe that consciousness somehow emerges from physical processes in the brain, then we need to explain how mathematical descriptions of neural activity can give rise to the qualitative feel of experience. This is the hard problem that continues to challenge philosophers and scientists today. Descartes believed that animals, lacking rational souls, were essentially machines, complex biological mechanisms that could behave in sophisticated ways without having any inner experience or consciousness. A dog might yelp when kicked, but this was just a mechanical response, like a bell ringing when struck, not an indication of genuine pain or suffering. This view seems harsh to modern sensibilities, and few people today would accept it. But it followed logically from Descartes' understanding of consciousness as tied to rational thought and language. Animals, in his view, did not truly think, did not have the kind of self-aware rationality that characterized human consciousness, and therefore did not have genuine experiences or feelings. This raises an interesting question about the relationship between consciousness and language, between awareness and the capacity for rational thought. Must a being be able to use language to be conscious? Must it be capable of abstract reasoning to have experiences? Or is consciousness more basic and widespread than Descartes imagined, present not only in humans but in animals, perhaps even in some form in simpler organisms? Contemporary philosophy of mind and cognitive science grapple with these questions, trying to understand the relationship between different levels of consciousness, from simple awareness to self-awareness to higher order thought about one's own mental states. The emphasis Descartes placed on innate ideas, on knowledge that is built into the structure of the mind rather than learned from experience, was another important aspect of his philosophy. He believed that certain fundamental concepts and principles were innate, present in the mind from birth, waiting to be activated by experience rather than created by it. The idea of God, the axioms of mathematics, the basic principles of logic, these were not learned but discovered within, recognized as true through the natural light of reason that God had implanted in every rational mind. This nativism, this belief in innate knowledge, was challenged by empiricist philosophers like John Locke, who argued that the mind at birth is a blank slate, a tabula rasa, and that all knowledge comes from experience through the senses. The debate between rationalists and empiricists, between those who emphasized innate knowledge and reason and those who emphasized experience and observation, would shape philosophy for centuries. And in our own time, cognitive science has provided evidence that both sides had insights. The mind is not entirely blank at birth. There are indeed innate structures and predispositions. But neither is knowledge simply waiting to be discovered within. Much must be learned through interaction with the world. As sleep draws even closer, as the last threads of waking consciousness begin to dissolve, you can appreciate how Descartes' questions remain alive, remain relevant, remain part of the ongoing human attempt to understand ourselves and our place in reality. What can we know with certainty? What is the relationship between mind and body? How does consciousness arise from matter? What makes us who we are? These are not questions that can be answered once and for all. They are questions that each generation must ask anew, in light of new knowledge and new experience, questions that shape how we understand ourselves and our world. The geometric method that Descartes applied to philosophy, the attempt to derive all knowledge from a few self-evident axioms through rigorous logical deduction, mirrored his work in mathematics, where he invented analytic geometry, showing how geometric problems could be solved algebraically and algebraic problems could be visualized geometrically. This fusion of algebra and geometry, this insight that the two were fundamentally connected was one of Descartes' most important contributions to mathematics. It showed that different domains of knowledge could be unified, that deep connections existed between apparently separate fields of study. This impulse toward unity, toward finding the fundamental principles that underlie apparent diversity, characterizes much of Descartes' work. He wanted to show that physics and mathematics were deeply connected, that the physical world was fundamentally mathematical. He wanted to show that epistemology and metaphysics were connected, that an understanding how we know leads to understanding what exists. He wanted to create a unified system of knowledge, a complete philosophy that would encompass everything from the nature of God to the laws of physics to the workings of the human body. Whether such complete unification is possible remains an open question. Knowledge has become increasingly specialized, fragmented into distinct disciplines with their own methods and vocabularies. The dream of a single system that explains everything seems more distant now than it did in Descartes' time. And yet, the impulse toward synthesis, toward finding connections and underlying principles, remains vital to both philosophy and science. We still seek theories that unify apparently separate phenomena, still look for fundamental principles, still hope to find deep patterns in the complexity of reality. Descartes wrote near the end of his Meditations about the practical wisdom of trusting our senses in everyday life, even while maintaining philosophical awareness of their possible unreliability. We must live in the world, must navigate our environment, must interact with objects and other people. And for these practical purposes, our senses are generally reliable guides. We should not remain paralyzed by philosophical doubt, should not refuse to trust anything because absolute certainty is unattainable. Philosophical skepticism is a tool for understanding, a method for discovering truth, not a practical stance for living. This distinction between philosophical reflection and practical life is important. The questions Descartes raised in his philosophical moments, the radical doubts he entertained in his meditation, these were not meant to disrupt ordinary life or create anxiety. They were meant to clear the mind, to establish foundations, to achieve clarity. Once that philosophical work was done, one could return to ordinary life with greater understanding, but without the paralysis that would come from applying radical doubt to every action and decision. Philosophy and life exist in different registers, serve different purposes, require different attitudes. The influence of Descartes extended beyond philosophy into theology, politics, and culture. His emphasis on individual reason, on the capacity of each person to think for themselves and arrive at truth, supported the emerging values of intellectual freedom and individual autonomy. His mechanical account of the physical world, while preserving a place for the soul, nevertheless contributed to the gradual secularization of nature, the view that the natural world operates according to its own laws rather than through constant divine intervention. His confidence in human reason, while tempered by acknowledgement of human fallibility, nevertheless reflected and reinforced an optimistic view of human cognitive capacities. But this legacy is complex and contested. Some see Descartes as a champion of reason and clarity, a thinker who helped free humanity from superstition and dogma. Others see him as contributing to problematic aspects of modernity, to the domination of nature, to the alienation of mind from body and self from world, to an overconfidence in individual reason, divorced from community and tradition. Like all influential thinkers, Descartes' legacy is mixed. His insights valuable even where his conclusions might be questioned. His influence pervasive even among those who disagree with him. The philosophy has served its purpose. It has occupied the mind, has given consciousness something to attend to during the transition toward sleep, has provided a calm and peaceful framework for relaxation. But now its work is done. The ideas dissolve, the arguments fade. The great meditation of Descartes becomes just another thought arising and passing away in the vast space of awareness, becoming just another wave in the ocean of consciousness, becoming nothing, becoming silence, becoming sleep.